Hey, it's Huck. And, you know, I always try to keep these brief, and I always fail miserably. However, we'll make another attempt here. I want to thank, you know, my viewers. I've been getting some assistance here all along. You know, and once in a while I'll get a gift through my GoFundMe page that I, you know, just wasn't expecting, and this is what happened here on the eve of Easter here, and I'll be honest, it couldn't have come at a better time. I have to, I'm badly in need of some new tires on my car. A car, mind you, that I'm not quite sure I should be investing in at this point. But as I don't have the money to, you know, buy even another used vehicle anytime soon, I guess tires are going to be the investment that I'm going to make. However, that's not the topic of today's video. I just wanted to throw a shout out, I guess, to you know, to the help that I'm getting, and let you know how much it means to me, how much it keeps me going. I'm able to live in somewhat, well, let me put it this way. You know, without the financial assistance I've been receiving here, I honestly could not pay my monthly bills. Without totally giving up, you know, my internet, TV, much of my medicine. And so, through the kindness of others, I've been able to do all of that, and even put just a little bit aside for these kind of emergencies or other things. And you know, I think the greatest stress that life throws upon us sometimes is financial uncertainty, and you know, it's tough. It's tough. My parents lived this way all through their lives, and I certainly did through most of my life, living paycheck to paycheck, knowing that at any time, you know, an illness, just missing a week or two of work, or in some cases a day or two of work, or, you know, a car problem or whatever, could be a total disaster and a financial, you know, catastrophe. And so, you know, I have been able to avoid those things for the most part. And so it has alleviated some of the added stress and, you know, worry that that I would have otherwise had to deal with. I can't tell you how grateful I am for your kindness. But the topic of today is the astonishing success and hope being brought before the world stage by the survivors of the Parkland school shooting. These teenagers have managed to begin, I think, something that, at least historically, all great political movements require. And it's always done by young people, almost without fail. Our own American Revolution began largely, you know, by people right around their ages. But if you look at the women's suffragette movement, if you look at the civil rights movement, if you look at, the Black Lives Matter movement, all through American history, the anti-war movement during Vietnam, they were all begun by a movement of young people. And I think there's a reason why youth meet with success, where so many of us who have been in the trenches for so long on some of the same causes don't meet with such success usually. And I think part of it is the fact that I think youth haven't been indoctrinated to the point where they think their voice won't be heard. They haven't even considered the idea that they ought to give up because it's hopeless. And I think many of us who are, older and been through round after round after round of these school shootings, for instance, and seen, no real progress being made, despite, Columbine, despite Sandy Hook, an event that I think everybody thought would move mountains. When that failed, I think there was largely a hopelessness that kind of fell over an awful lot of people, even people who should probably know better. But youth have no such cynicism. And I think that's one of the reasons why they are effective. The key here, of course, is going to be how they motivate other young people and whether they can build on the momentum that they have sustained so far. And all signs seem to be that their movement is not slowing down, but that one by one they are beginning to pick off more and more targets, as Fox News' Laura Ingraham is experiencing just recently. So I want to get across one other thought. If you look at the Parkland survivors, I guess I'll call them, these students, have kind of released a 5-point plan of expectations of what they hope to accomplish, and they're quite modest, all in all. Among the 5 effective changes that they would like to see on the gun issue is, of course, a ban on assault rifles, semi-automatic rifles, and a ban on high-capacity magazines. And they would like to see universal background checks, without the loopholes. They would like to see some changes in the ATF enforcement of firearm regulations, and that is still rather modest proposal. And of course, they would like to see more funding for the study of gun violence in this country. More federal funding to find out, among other things, what type of legislation and regulation would be most effective in reducing gun violence in this country. One of the things they say that they are not proposing is a repeal of the Second Amendment. And it's interesting that John Paul Stevens, a former Supreme Court justice, now I believe in his 90s, has come out in recent days suggesting that repeal of the Second Amendment is very much one of the things we should be shooting for. So I think it would be prudent to just briefly kind of rehash over what the Second Amendment really is, a little bit of its history, and maybe even reference John Paul Stevens' place in that history. There has not been a tremendous amount of Supreme Court cases that have taken up issues involving firearms, and when that issue has come up, generally it has been a very narrow look at the Second Amendment and what it means. Prior to the decision known as the Heller decision, the case in which John Paul Stevens gave a famous dissenting opinion, up until the Heller decision, the Supreme Court had basically upheld the interpretation that the Second Amendment in no way guaranteed an individual's right to bear and keep arms. It had been interpreted right up into what is known as the Miller decision, which is probably the most had been the most recent Supreme Court decision prior to Heller. Right up through the Miller decision, Supreme Court had basically interpreted the Second Amendment, I think, well, for 200 years, as precisely what it had always been intended to mean, and that is that it was a guarantee that states would have a right to arm its own militias, with the purpose being that the founders were absolutely adamant that they were opposed to a national standing army. And so state militias would be called up for the purpose of a national army, but also because many southern states relied on their militias as their defense against potential slave rebellions. And finally, because militias would be a guarantee of state protection from any federal tyranny. So, one of the things that Heller did, the key element in the Heller decision, was the idea, according to Justice Scalia, who wrote the decision, that an individual had a right, according to the Second Amendment, to keep and possess in his own home, for his own protection and other purposes, the right to own a gun. This individual's right via the Second Amendment was a completely new train of thought. And Justice Stevens argued in his dissent that there is no such interpretive meaning without going way outside of bounds. For instance, Justice Stevens referenced the 1776 Pennsylvania State Constitution, where in Pennsylvania State Constitution it specifically mentions the individual's right to keep and bear arms, not just for purposes of militia. And the wording used in the Pennsylvania State Constitution and the wording used in, another example would be the Virginia State Constitution, is very specific. And because these were written, prior, 3 years prior to the American Constitution, and because one of them, in fact, the Virginia State Constitution, was actually written by the same person who wrote the U.S. Constitution, Mason, Madison, James Madison. The idea that they would, simply forget, or that it was an oversight, or that it wasn't necessary, is bizarre to say the least. What Scalia did in his interpretation of the Second Amendment was, rather than use the preamble of the Second Amendment, where it talks about a well-regulated militia as being the purpose, Scalia designates this preamble as a more or less as an afterthought. I have honestly always felt that the Second Amendment not only is not a guarantor of individual right to own and possess a gun. To me, it was obvious because, for instance, at the time of our Constitution's writing and years thereafter, it was illegal to own and possess a gun in your own home in many major cities. Boston, for instance, it was illegal. Why would that be? Well, it was because that if you had a gun back then, a loaded gun was a fire hazard, and they didn't want them, in more or less urban areas and cities. because of the potential harm it could do, not just to the home itself and people in it, but to, you know, whole neighborhoods or the whole community. There's a lot of examples, in fact, of if you go back and read the Federalist Papers. Scalia was known as a textualist, and he claimed that by just, you know, taking the words for what they were intended to always mean, you know, he came up with his interpretation, and he got 4 other conservative justices to throw out basically 200 years of precedent. And a lot of that Heller decision came on top of about 20 years of NRA pushing for just such an interpretation, and a good 30 years since. And so now, even many of the most liberal, most progressive, you know, politicians out there are afraid to go back and take a look at that. I mean, you hear everyone talk about how you know, they're not out to you know, repeal the Second Amendment. You know, everybody honors the Second Amendment. So my 2 thoughts on this are, 1, the Second Amendment is already obsolete. For what it is and what it actually was intended to do, the fact that we now have a national standing army, the fact that the states don't need to defend themselves against rebellious slaves. The purpose of the Second Amendment is all but moot. Second, the Second Amendment never was intended to guarantee anybody's individual right to own, much less use, their own gun for non-military purposes. That being said, it must also be recognized, and this is what politicians mean by, you know, that they wish to honor the Second Amendment. As it is now, at least currently, interpreted, and again, I completely disagree with the Heller decision. I completely concur with Justice Stevens' dissent. And you can read that online. I won't go into it, but most of the court voted 5-4 on this decision, and Justice had, I think, the other 3 justices. Mailman. Gigi. Gigi. No. No. Why do dogs hate the mailman? At any rate, there was more than one opposing judge concurring with Justice Stevens on this. I think all 4 attached themselves to Stevens' dissent. However, the point is, the Heller decision, as it is written, makes no bones about the fact that it still allows for the screening or the banning of dangerous, quote, dangerous weapons, and also, it also affords the ability to ban certain people felons, for instance, from its otherwise guarantee. So, in that sense, there is nothing in these modest 5 proposals by these brought forth by the Parkland survivors, the 5 things that they're asking. There's nothing in there that would be a violation of the Second Amendment. One of the ways that the gun rights advocates seem to get their way is not just because of the money pouring into the NRA that then gets funneled to all of these candidates, and it's not just the fact that the NRA threatens to primary out, any, particularly Republicans, who don't take a hard line against any and all regulation of the firearm industry. Although those are significant aspects of the gun rights movement. The other very real aspect is the fact that the NRA and gun rights advocates in general use fear and intimidation tactics very much at the heart of demoralizing and scaring, frankly, those who would oppose them. They do this by passing open carry laws so that these gun rights advocates can walk around militantly carrying their assault rifles. They do it by attacking people online with veiled threats and name-calling. I'll get many comments, I suspect, on this video. At least I certainly have on several of my other videos. And I simply, I've gotten to the point where I just almost refuse to engage in it anymore because they're not really interested in a debate. They're interested in, calling you things like snowflake and just, having an excruciatingly hard time hearing or reading any sensible thing you have to say and just repeating ad nauseum their own, rhetoric. So what gives me hope in this latest movement led by these young people is that they're not having it. They're not having it at all. And they're not going to try to change anybody's opinion. They're going to try to motivate and unite the 70, 80, even 90% of the rest of us who really want to see some action. And that's really the best way to look at it. 3% of these gun nuts own 50% of the guns in this country. Nearly 90% of Americans want to see sensible gun reform, including universal background checks. Close to 70% want to see a ban on these military-style weapons. And you can get into these debates on what is an assault rifle and all this nonsense that these gun nuts will try to engage you in until you point out that you understand the fact that what defines an assault rifle, and when you explain the massive blood loss and carnage that these weapons and their velocity entail, the fact that they can use instantly interchangeably high-capacity magazines, for instance. So many facts that they don't want to deal with, they'll just move on to something else. And before you know it, you're debating, you know, the stupidest, mind-numbingly dumb proposals like only criminals will have guns. So, like I say, don't engage with the gun nuts. You know, it'll do you no good. You'll just be pulling your hair out for no good reason. Instead, I think the young people are probably on the right track. And we need to do everything we can to do exactly what they're asking us to do. Mobilize the rest of us to get out and vote the bums out of Congress that, you know, that are giving in to the fear and giving in to the intimidation and the corruption. Anyway, I have spoken way, way, way too long. See what I mean? I get started and I can't stop. And, you know, I'm just going to have to get better at this. Listen, I thank you so much for watching, especially if you've managed to watch this long. And I hope everybody enjoys their Easter weekend. I'm not a terribly religious person, as you probably know. But I do remember, you know, devoting myself an entire summer when I was like 15, 16, to, you know, the album Jesus Christ Superstar, you know, the first album when it first came out, the concept album, you know, before it was a Broadway show. And I must have listened to that thing repeatedly for so long. I remember camping up at Pymatuming. We were in a cottage. One of the rare times we stayed in a cottage. I think it was because Grandma and Grandpa had the cottage. And I kind of locked myself in the bedroom for like 3 days listening to this album on my phonograph over and over and over again until my mom finally took my phonograph away and said, "Get outside!" Which just goes to show you what a stranglehold the music had on me. And it is a very moving, you know, look at the life of Christ. So, you know, that has never left me. And it, as a purely human story, it is powerful. So I'm very much, I like John Legend a lot. I love listening to John Legend. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that tomorrow night. So anyway, as always, I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again real soon.